I think we should now begin. Welcome everybody. And as we customarily do, as we begin, we acknowledge the fact that we are on the country of one of the first peoples of Australia. And here I'm on the country of the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung people. And wherever we are, we acknowledge the elders of our country people and ancestors with respect. A couple of things about getting the best value out of the meeting is make sure that you keep your mic muted so that we can't pick up the background noises going on around your place. And also, my strong recommendation is that you select speaker view rather than gallery view, so that you'll get a clear view of the person who's speaking at that time. And I think that'll make it much easier for you. This is the final meeting of the first 5 months of the year, where we've been following a pattern of how do we live a progressive Christian life, with particular reference to how we may have been assisted in this by some of the leading writers of our time and on progressive Christian matters. I hope you've found it a very useful stream to follow. I will now pass over to Lorna Henry, who will introduce David Merritt, who's going to be our principal speaker today with some assistance. And she'll explain what it is that David is going to be talking about and how it's going to be, the meeting's going to be conducted. So over to you, Lorna.
Thanks, Dick. Good afternoon, everyone, and hearty welcome on this very cold weather. It's really nice to be able to be doing this from the comfort of our homes. And welcome to everybody. Thanks for joining us in this final of the series of looking at progressive Christianity, the heroes, the great leaders we've had, and it's all about the living. How do we best live is affected by our choice of the Christianity, the sort of Christianity we choose. And today's title, How Can We Know What Jesus Taught, comes with a particular reference to Dr. David Golston, as you've read in all your flyers. Embracing the Human Jesus was the title of his book, particularly being referred to. He's a Westar scholar. And as is usual, I'll have it in 3 parts with speakers. I'll just outline that. You would have seen it in your flyer. David Merritt will first of all talk to us about the work of Dr. David Golston. And then we have a presentation which is twofold, where you'll see the mention of Reverend Dr. Rex Hunt in your flyer. Rex is actually not able to be with us, not on video or on Zoom, but we will have his words read to us by Greg, and that will be Rex Hunt's presentation today. And then we come back to David Merritt again, and David will introduce to us a couple of parables so that we can look at them with a different view. Thanks again to David Golston. So here we are. David Merritt. I refuse to introduce you again informally, David Merritt. Everybody knows David as a founding member of our PCNV, and he has been the inspiration behind this series that we're having and drawing to a conclusion today. David, I'm very happy to introduce you, so you can introduce David Golston to us.
Lorna, thank you very much, and hello to everyone. As both Dick and Lorna have said, this is the final in a series of 5 programs exploring the contribution to possibilities for being Christian, possibilities described by outstanding scholars in the progressive tradition. The series seemed especially worth doing in light of the increasing flow of reports that tell us that traditional churches are declining, and there seems to be very little evidence that in traditional churches they are exploring opportunities as alternatives to what they're doing that isn't working that well. This is the fifth program. The first program proved to be somewhat unexpectedly relevant to all the programs and is relevant to today. In that first program, we looked at the work of Marcus Borg, who described for us two ways, as Lorna has referred to it, two ways that Christians make a choice about the kind of Christianity they followed. Marcus Borg provided a table which set out in the left-hand side what conservative Christians have done in the last 4 centuries, and on the right-hand side, what progressive Christians or alternatives to traditional Christians have done in that 400 years. The significance of the 400 years or 4 centuries was that at the beginning of the 17th century, Galileo made a discovery that set in motion a lot of changes. Using a telescope, he actually observed the movement of planets, and as a result of observations, he announced that the evidence was that, contrary to the Christian belief promulgated at the time, the Earth was not the center of our universe with the sun rotating around it, but the sun was the center of the universe and the Earth rotated around it. As Christians at that time took as literally true the first 2 chapters of Genesis, which describe, are in fact myths about the creation of the world, the church refused to accept what Galileo had said, and he was confined to virtual house arrest for the rest of his life. On the left-hand side of that table, Marcus Borg described the steady resistance to every new set of human thinking, from Galileo through the discoveries of evolution, the discoveries of circulation of blood in the body, the discoveries about the nature of our lives. And by early in the 20th century, conservatives had met to formulate a statement about what they assumed were to be fundamentals of religion, hence the term fundamentalist that became prominent. And they said that the literal truth of Scripture as originally given, the birth of Jesus from a virgin, the entry of God into human life in Jesus, Jesus' death on the cross for the sins of humans, that if they trusted in him would bring forgiveness and eternal life, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead to be with God the Father until he comes again to destroy this present earth, make a judgment of people on it, and bring about a new heaven and a new earth. Now, later on, you'll hear a reference from in the report on the report about the views of Rex Hunt. The word apocalyptic will be used a number of times, and that apocalyptic refers to catastrophe, a disastrous end to the world, and that in fact is the traditional view of Christianity, and it's reflected in many ways in the services of many, if not most, traditional churches. Now, in the last few programs, we've heard from John Shelby Spong both about understanding the Bible and about Christianity. Spong said about the Bible, it's full of dreadful things. Some of the ideas are absurd. The Bible is not about religion, it's about how to live. We heard from New Zealand scholar Lloyd Gearing that he urges us to stop looking back so much 20 to 30 centuries to the writings of the first century and the centuries where the Old Testament was developed, and instead to look at the life in which we are immersed now in the 21st century, to look not only at its problems, but also its wisdom. And he pointed out that much of that wisdom has in fact been influenced by the teachings of Jesus. And that wisdom, he said, would guide us in good stead as we tackle the problems. So today, in the final of this series, we look at the writing of a contemporary scholar. It's great to be reporting on someone who is at the peak of his career and teaching at the present time. David Galston is a Canadian. He stands out because of his work embracing the human Jesus, a pathway for contemporary Christians, a wisdom pathway for contemporary Christians. He speaks about being Christian in a time that we live now in a way that's relevant to us. I must say I was attracted to Galston's work because he not only writes about a new way, but he actually tried it out in practice. He formed a community instead of a church that explored the ideas he presents and developed a way of living and being a community in light of them. Some of you will know I was likely to be hooked also when I saw that he called that community the Quest Learning Centre. And I've been involved for around 15 years in a group called Quest, exploring alternatives to traditional Christianity. And while that hasn't been anywhere near the depth or with the expertise of David Galston, it's been a remarkable experience and a delight to share with open-minded and warm-hearted people about being Christian and being immersed in the 21st century. So, what does David Galston say to us? His book's been around for about 10 years. He sets out the results of recent scholarship, particularly about the New Testament Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, which is where we find the teachings of Jesus. He shows how the Gospel writers used a few earlier writings and mainly orally transmitted memories, and that the teachings of Jesus were expressed specially in two ways. In short, sharp, sometimes funny sayings that attracted attention, called by the scholars aphorisms, and by parables, which are short stories, dramatic, sometimes claiming attention because of their humor, but easily memorable. And but those two kinds of sayings were easily transmitted orally in a culture where there was no printing, there was no electronic transmission, and any teacher who wanted to have his work understood needed to develop ways of speaking which captured attention, encapsulated the important parts of the teaching in short, succinct summaries. So David Galston guides us to look at some of those aphorisms, those short, sharp sayings, and then concentrates on the parables. You can probably remember, almost certainly remember, some of those short, sharp sayings. For example, why are you looking at the speck in your neighbour's eye when you have a plank in your own eye? Deal with the plank in your own eye first, then turn your attention to your neighbour. Or it could be, it is more difficult for a rich man to pass through the eye of a needle than to enter the kingdom of God. It's not only sharp and memorable, it's confronting and raises issues that if you heard them from Jesus would need consideration by you, especially if you were a rich person. The main part of Galston's work is about the parables. And parables are short stories. They're about everyday life. They're in the language of everyday life, but they capture a situation or a dilemma that raises issues about how to live. And parables involve us in somehow visualizing a different world to live in. So parables, Galston says, are stories of perspective on the everyday world where something different is happening. And because Jesus lived mainly in Galilee, a part of Palestine that was desperately poor, was occupied by the Roman military, most of the stories were about the basics of everyday working life for poor people. And in those stories, the parables, listeners are invited into a different world and think differently about something that would involve a change in how they live. Parables, Galston says, are about lifestyle. If you let the parable enter your mind and take notice of it, you are being invited to live in a different way. And Galston uses the concept, as some other scholars do, of the voice print of Jesus. If we see footprints in the sand, we can tell a lot about who was there. My partner and I were walking a couple of days ago around a football ground where suddenly in front of us on the concrete were big black footprints of a very large dog. And as we walked, we were talking about how big the dog must have been to leave that print. So footprints are what are left behind to tell us something about who's been there. And Galston says that a major theme in the voice print of Jesus, the signs Jesus left behind of what was important, come to the surface with parables. Almost every one of you, I'm sure, will know the well-known parable of the Good Samaritan. It's so well known that most Australians know the expression, a Good Samaritan, someone who helps or rescues someone in trouble. But when you look at the parable Jesus told, that's definitely not all that is in his story of the Good Samaritan. The parable of the Good Samaritan was Jesus' answer to a Jewish religious leader who asked what the key to eternal life was and who quoted the second most important commandment from the Jewish scriptures as love your neighbor as yourself. And the gospel writer says that Jesus agreed with that, but because he wanted to show himself as a know-all about the law, that's the Jewish first 5 books of the Old Testament, he said to Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" And he got a story in reply that still blows us away from our comfort zone. The parable of the Jewish man beaten up by robbers on a lonely road was told to Jewish religious leaders, and just call to mind again now who the characters in that story of the Good Samaritan were. A Jewish man beaten up on the road. The first 2 passers-by are the absolutely top people in the Jewish religion, a priest and a worker in the temple, and they ignored the man. The next person along was a Samaritan, and if you read your Gospels, you'll find there are a couple of places where it said the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritan. The Samaritans had a rival temple on Mount Gerizim, and the Jews had their temple in Jerusalem. They definitely disapproved of each other. So along comes this Samaritan with his donkey and assists the wounded man, walks him, holding him on the back of the donkey to an inn further down the track, pays for his keep, and assures the innkeeper he'll come back and pay it. And then Jesus in the parable says, who was the neighbor? And the Jewish law expert said, the one who helped him. And Jesus said, go and do the same. But it was doing the same across religious and likes and dislike boundaries. It was acting in a way that wouldn't normally have been acted upon because the motivation was to help someone. So a parable to his hearers actually was a bit of dynamite. And I think if we look at it and take it into our minds and think about it, it could be quite dynamic for us. Galston points out that Jesus rarely spoke about God. And when he did, he talked about the kingdom of God. That is about what life would be like in ordinary life if it became life that expressed the rule of God. He pointed out that the whole point of wisdom for living is in a style of living, a lifestyle consistent with a vision of the world, and that's what the parable's about. Galston points out that Jesus did not ask people to believe in him or to have faith in him. Now, I know the gospel writers did, and the church later did. In fact, they concentrated on more than anything else. But Jesus' most common saying after his teaching was, let those who have ears listen. If you have ears, listen. Or as one of the modern translations says, let those who have ears use them. So if you take away nothing from today, except that bit so far, you will receive something very worthwhile. Jesus did not ask us to believe in him. That was a development of later religious leaders about Jesus. Jesus asked people to listen to him and to take in their view of life and their living what they heard. So Galston wrote, and I quote, a move to life founded on the historical Jesus isn't about rejecting Christianity. It's simply a question of moving Christianity onto a different and more credible path for our time. His book, Embracing the Human Jesus, I find a very stimulating book that makes me wistful for a different Christianity to the traditional Christianity that seems to be fading around us. And if we can commend it to you today, you might find it a doorway to something quite hopeful. A bit later, I'm going to come back to two parables that confront us with options, not about being Christian in church, but about living different ways that Galston picks out as important. And I'm going to read the biblical description of that parable and what Galston says about it, which I hope you'll find interesting and challenging. But first, our second speaker will add to our understanding of why David Galston is significant. Thanks, Lorna.
Okay, it's better. Thank you for that. And as I explained before, Rex Hunt is not actually with us, but his words and thoughts are. And these will be brought to us by Greg Crow, kindly offered to read these for us. I should let you know a little bit about Rex Hunt in case anybody is unaware. Rex is a New South Wales person. Rex is a retired Progressive Uniting Church minister. He lives on the New South Wales Central Coast. He's been a past leader of progressive religion movements in Australia, but his interest over the past 20 years has been shaped around religious naturalism, where he also serves on the International Board of Religious Naturalist Association of the US. I would like to have asked Rex a little bit more about that, but he's not here to answer. So we'll have to leave that. Religious Naturalist Association. Rex's most recent published writing is a chapter in Greg Jenks's collection, Interfaith Afterlives of Jesus, Jesus in Global Perspective 2, which has recently been published as part of a West Star series. So that's Rex. And now, thanks, Greg, for bringing us the words and thoughts.
Thanks, Lorna. Yes, I'm not Rex Hunt, and I was asked, and I was asked by David if I would read Rex's brief offering. So, but what I might do is actually screen share it and read it so that people can see the actual words. So here we go. So you can actually see what Rex is saying. So his introductory comments for this seminar, Embracing Galston's Human Jesus. For 2,000 years, the sage we call Yeshua, or Jesus, has been represented to the world in terms of latter inferences drawn from his sayings and deeds, rather than in terms of what he himself did and said. But now, with the new work being done by scholars on both the extra-canonical materials, such as the Gospels of Thomas and Mary, as well as that on the early Christianities, we have this opportunity to reevaluate Jesus. So enter the publishing scene David Galston's second book, Embracing the Human Jesus, A Wisdom Path for Contemporary Christianity. Galston visited Melbourne back in 2015, and I might add, I was happy to meet David myself when I was in at the West Star Spring Festival with Dick and Heather back in 2019, amongst the other West Star scholars, and he's a great guy. He's the co-founder and co-director of the Snow Star Institute of Religion and executive director of West Star. Re-evaluating Jesus is not a novel idea. The first century did it to develop its proclamation. The latter church did it to develop the creeds, and the current mega church Pentecostal Christianity does it every day. But Galston presents a very human, natural Jesus, born of woman and the Hebrew gene pool, and suggesting a possible Jesus is not an incredible one. A possible Jesus is an impoverished Palestinian situated in his historical circumstances in the northwest corner of Galilee, in the early Roman Empire, sometime between the years 26 to 36 CE. Who did things and said things that a real person could have reasonably believed or done at that time. An incredible Jesus, says Galston, is the one who came from the sky and performed miracles by fiat, and who was as dead as a doornail only to magically return to life. With a scenario spinner's imagination, this teacher of wisdom and practical lifestyle invited others to reimagine the world. His tools of trade were parables, short secular stories, and aphorisms. Most of his stories feature characters from the peasant class in an agrarian village society, all part and parcel of first century Judaism. But what sort of Jesus was heard? From the 19th century onwards, Jesus was heard as an apocalyptic Jesus, that is, apocalyptic concerns of God ridding the world of evil and sending time back to square one, override wisdom, lifestyle teaching, and it shaped both the orthodox form of theology and worship. Galston challenges this accepted state by suggesting we need to unhear apocalyptic. The apocalyptic Jesus model does very poorly when addressing the main thing to be said about Jesus, that he spoke in parable. Since a parable is not a proclamation but a metaphor, it is a very different form of language. And apocalyptic also does very poorly when it shapes the worship experience. Traditional liturgy is based on the apocalyptic movement from crisis to resolution, where humans are in sin and in need of redemption. Liturgy shaped by the historical human Jesus, on the other hand, has a different movement and language, from a focus upward on the divine gods to imminent care for the earth and the human family. The language of imminence is the language of wisdom, and this must be the language of the historical Jesus community. Thus, Galston spends the last 2 chapters plus 3 appendix specifically drawing out the theological and liturgical challenges such a human Jesus makes for contemporary Christianity, especially when taking the historical Jesus to church. His liturgy in the key of Q is most exciting, in my opinion, in Rex's opinion. The community gathers in peace and solidarity. It sings and it meditates, it learns and shares a banquet, then it parts with good wishes. It is the same order of traditional Christianity, but not the same words, the same spirit or same intention. The theme is one of openness and honesty. The heart is one of compassion and understanding. There is no magic to liturgy except for what is brought to the gathering by the people. The historical human Jesus demands honesty, honest thinking about history and about life, an honest encounter with the self and the world. The historical Jesus, Galston claims, may pose the most significant revision Christianity has faced in a very long time. And that's all for me.
Good. Thank you very much, Greg. And we'll move straight along to part 3, which brings us back to David Merritt. And David will bring us face to face with a couple of those parables of which he spoke and which we heard highlighted in Rex's words too. David, a couple of prime examples for us to think about. Thank you.
Yes, I want to take a closer look at what Jesus taught. Just going back to one of the things that Rex Hunt said towards the end of those passages that Greg read, he refers to worship in the key of Q. Now, scholars among you will know what he's talking about, but scholars' analysis of the Gospels finds, for example, looking at Matthew and Luke, that there are big blocks of identical material. One explanation of that is that they both copied very large chunks of Mark's Gospel, which is acknowledged as the first. But there was also some material there that seemed almost identical in both Gospels, which went beyond that material copied from Mark, and it seemed to be mainly sayings of Jesus. And scholars called that common material Q because it was the start of the German word for source. So a worship or a gathering in the key of Q, which Galston refers to, would be a gathering which was about the sayings of Jesus. And that has been especially what Galston concentrates on. Scholars like David Galston have told us that we cannot know with certainty the detail of what Jesus taught in many subjects because there's not enough evidence to back up that what they said was actually what Jesus said about specific topics. You might say, well, if it's in Mark and it's in Matthew and it's Luke and it's the same, isn't that 3 people agreeing so we can take that as reliable support for the statement? But if you manage to follow what I said earlier, the reason that it's the same is because both Matthew and Luke copied about 2/3 of Mark into their Gospels. So for any of the sayings that is there, the fact that they're there by one person is not sufficient to be certain that that's what Jesus said rather than what the writer of the gospel wanted to say. However, Galston says we can know the sort of thing Jesus taught because in those days before printing and widespread reading ability, effective teachers, as I mentioned earlier, had to have effective oral communication so that it could be repeated frequently. And parables were one of those distinctive parts of Jesus' teaching. Vivid action stories with challenges or humour that grab attention and are relatively easy to remember. And they also travel well as oral history, in a sense, could be picked up later in the century by other writers. People in churches, I think, tend to know a few comfortable parables. The shepherd who goes looking for a lost sheep. And I must say, when I noticed the illustrations that he used for that, the shepherd's gown is sparkling white, could be used in an ad for Rinso. And the lamb is little white and woolly, not at all like the dirty work of going out and hunting for a lost sheep, but that's an aside. The parable of the lost sheep or the parable of the Good Samaritan, which I mentioned in my earlier talk. But there are other parables by Jesus, stories that confront our prejudices. And I've chosen two to share with you today that I found stirring in Galston's descriptions of what was going on in those parables. And I assure you, it's not about a photogenic shepherd with a nice woolly lamb. It's issues in ordinary life that could involve us. And as I'll mention before the second one, could stir us somewhat and stir us to disagreement. So here's the first one. I want to read the parable of the great banquet. And in each of these parables, I'll read the scriptures exactly as they are and then read Galston's comments on them. And I hope you find that an interesting way to proceed. So the parable of the great banquet, and I'm reading from Luke chapter 14. It comes in a scene where Jesus is seated at a meal table with a pretty varied group. When one of those at the table with him heard what he said to Jesus, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." Now, just as an aside, it's a standard religious red herring or bytrack to move from the present world to something in the afterworld. And that's what the person at the table said to Jesus. "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." Jesus replied, and here's the story. "A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell all those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, 'I've just bought a field and I must go and see it. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I've just bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me.' Still another said, 'I just got married, so I can't come.' The servant came back and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servant, 'Go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame.' 'Sir,' the servant said, 'what you have ordered has been done, but there's still room.' Then the master told his servant, 'Go out into the roads and the country lanes and compel them to come in so that my house will be full. I tell you, not one of those who were invited will get a taste of my banquet.'" End of Luke. And now to Galston from pages 107, 108. Hyperbole. Now there's a word for you. Hyperbole is unnecessary exaggeration. I always remember the definition of hyperbole given by someone who said hyperbole is the story of the 10 foolish virgins, 5 foolish virgins would have been enough. Back to Galston. Hyperbole is nowhere better expressed in the Jesus tradition than in the parable of the dinner party. Another Q story found in the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of Matthew, and the Gospel of Thomas. And as I'll mention later, each Gospel writer changed parts of the story to fit his particular preferences, and Galston draws attention to that. As with familiar sayings heard over and over again, sheer repetition also hides the original comedy and social poignancy of parables, so it is work to recapture their sense. In the parable of the dinner party, an anonymous householder of some means invites a number of people from his social class to a banquet. The point of such gatherings in antiquity and even today was not only social but also commercial. It was necessary to reinforce one's community standing among class peers and reinforce economic ties. So this is a gathering of like-minded people of comparable wealth. The parable assumes the invitations have already been sent out and accepted, and the day of the gathering has arrived. Still Galston. According to custom, the householder sends out his servant to accompany his guests to the dinner. Shockingly, at the very last moment, when all the plans are completed, the banquet ready, and the servant is standing at the door, the guests start handing in their excuses. They are all lame excuses packaged in comic exaggeration. The first indicates that he's bought a farm even though he's never laid eyes on it. Another has bought some oxen without ever having inspected them. And the third guess indicates that he'd forgotten he was getting married that day. So there is a great feast prepared, but not a single person is coming to dinner. We can still laugh at the excuses. It's easy to see the humour. But what is more difficult in the modern context is to see the depth of insult that has happened here. Since the excuses are so ridiculous, we know that they're not true. What is true is that the household master has been shunned by members of his own class. He has effectively been demoted. He is probably on the verge of financial ruin. Yet remarkably, the householder does not wish a plague on his peers or some other act of vengeance. Instead, he discards the norms of his class-based society and begins to invite anyone off the street to pack his house in celebration. What began as economics ends as social defiance. The householder gets even, if you like, by creating an open society. The story seems to be the parable version of the saying, "How happy are the poor." In the Christian Gospels, each of the three writers interprets this parable with the motivation of revenge and the biases of special interests. In the Gospel of Thomas, just as an aside, the Gospel of Thomas is widely regarded as at about the same time as Mark and a valuable addition to the three synoptic Gospels. In the Gospel of Thomas, merchants are particularly highlighted as those excluded from the banquet. In other words, the writer of the Gospel of Thomas doesn't have a high opinion of merchants. In Luke, Luke holds special interest for the underclass. Thus, the banquet concludes with invitations sent out to the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. Matthew turns the whole parable into an apocalyptic and end-of-world allegory, illustrating end-time salvation. He makes the householder a king, the banquet is a wedding for his son, and the rejected invitations are effectively the rejection of the son. Matthew concludes the scene with the casting out of the unworthy. Yet the traces of the original parable remain evident, despite the change efforts of the gospel writers. The parable does not ask us to leave the world out, but to change it. It's a parable about altering, not eliminating, the privileges and identities of social class. Indeed, the parable corrupts privilege by turning the gathering into a party of nobodies. The revolution reveals a vision of life with a different texture. And it does so through the creative use of humour, transforming social stigma. It is truly a brilliant parable. It is also evidence of the speaking strategy of a Jesus school. Now, a moment while you run that through your minds, let you think of what Galston says parables are to do. They're to get into your mind, to be received by you, thought about, so that it is possible they will come to be reflected in some way in how you live. My second parable that Galston emphasises is the parable of the workers in the vineyard. Galston starts by saying this parable upset some people. Let me level with you that I tried out this parable with my quest group last Sunday, and it really stirred up some people. One man jumped to his feet and said loudly, "This is a bad story, it's unfair." I said, "Well, it's a Jesus story." And he said, "Then Jesus is wrong. It's a bad story." I thought that was so good. It showed that he actually understood most of the parable. And I considered inviting him to come along to our gathering today and give his response to start us thinking and to stir us up. But I've refrained from that. So my invitation to you is to get stuck into this parable, or let it get stuck into you. From Matthew chapter 20. The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day. A denarius was a Roman silver coin. It was the standard labourer's daily wage. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I'll pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about noon and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages. Begin with the last ones hired and then go on to the first." The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon, remember there's no electric lights here, it's daylight to dawn, so 5 is close to dusk. The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came and each received a denarius. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "Those who were hired last worked only 1 hour," they said, "and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day." "But," he answered one of them, "I am not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I'm generous? So the last will be first and the first will be last. End of the Gospel of Matthew. Now reading from David Galston on page from 65. The workers in the vineyard is an instructive example. It demonstrates the way the Gospel writer Matthew believed the parable should be interpreted. At the same time, when Matthew's comments are bracketed out, it demonstrates in a highly effective manner what a good parable is all about. Let's review the parable first. The scene, writes Galston, is completely common. Unemployed people stand around the marketplace hoping to be hired for the day. We can well envision Roman policies that expanded agricultural lands for estate holders and displaced peasant farmers in ancient Galilee. Poverty and homelessness followed. Very much like today, the weakest members of society suffered the consequences of economic policies tailored to benefit the well-off. The original audiences of the vineyard parable would have known the scene all too well. A few workers get hired for the day before the break of dawn. About 3 hours later, a few more lucky ones are chosen. Still later, another few get a break and can work, though the hour is already late. Finally, the parable brings us down to the last hour of daylight. No one gets hired at such a time since virtually everyone has finished for the day. At this point, the parable starts to warp reality. With only an hour of daylight left, another set of individuals gets hired. The fact they are hired so late is surprising, but so is the fact that they are still around waiting to be hired. The last group barely gets started when the day ends. Now all the workers are called to receive their wages, from those hired last to first. When the ones hired last at the very end of the day receive 1 denarius, a full day's wage, it seems as if the landlord is in a very generous mood. Those hired earliest in the day can hardly wait to claim the bigger prize. Instead, one by one, each group of labourers discovers that the landlord's generosity is reserved only for the first group. Those who work 1 hour get paid as much as those who worked all day long. It is patently unfair, yet in response to complaints, the landlord is right. Each worker agreed to work for a day's wage. It's the landlord's call. This parable often irks readers. I can tell you that's true. It seems remarkably wrong to pay a person who laboured all day absolutely the same wage as one who barely even had time to start. Had there been a labour union in existence, writes Galston, there would have rightly been an arbitration hearing. On the other hand, the payment is the correct amount. The transaction was completed according to the agreement of 1 day's wage struck with each worker at the time of hiring. The workers see the situation as unfair only in retrospect, when at the time of payment, the landlord will not follow the formula of payment per hours worked, even though the workers agreed to the same wage at the time of hiring. The workers' view shifts to the standard understanding that more work means more pay. The landlord does not shift the agreement. Rather, the landlord continues to hold the alternative standard of measurement. Payment is not for how long one labours, but for the fact that one labours. Though couched in everyday reality, this story is not really about workers and landlords, but about workers and landlords over there, Galston uses the phrase over there for a place that doesn't exist but can be described and pictured. The alternative standard of measurement, payment is not for how long one labours, the fact one labours. It is about workers and landlords over there. It's about a location, a lifestyle, where value is not related to time and where human activity is not measured on scales of worthiness and privilege. To be comfortable with the parable requires a kind of breakthrough in life. It's a question of seeing equilibrium in all aspects of life and knowing that in the parable world, waiting all day to be called to work is the same in value as working all day. The question is, can we cross over to the lifestyle of the parable world? If we feel troubled about going over to the parable world, maybe there's some comfort in knowing that Matthew had trouble with the journey too. Matthew hones the parable down to two distinctive elements. Because this payment involved from the landlord, the authority figure, to the workers, the dependents, Matthew's instinct is to interpret the landlord as God in heaven and the workers as disciples on earth who will receive an award when they die. Then Matthew places the parable in his gospel into a scene where disciples argue about reward they will receive for following Jesus. Well, according to Matthew, of course, they're going to get a reward when they inherit eternal life. Everyone who has left all to follow Jesus will receive 100-fold reward. But remember this warning, the last shall be first. Matthew successfully converts the parable into an allegory that illustrates the need to balance one's reward for following Jesus with the humility necessary to do it. The momentum and the persuasive force of the parable have been redirected by Matthew from teaching about a different vision of life to teaching about rewards and humility for Christians. With this parable, the momentum or the rhetorical strategy that Matthew has added needs to be identified and removed in order to hear the voice of Jesus. To hear the voice of Jesus means to hear a different view, the originating rather than the secondary momentum of the parable. In our world, at the present time, actually, those issues are argued about. We argue in our society about what should a person who is not working but unemployed receive? What proportion of the pay of a normal day's work or a living wage should someone unemployed work? That actually is an issue in our society. And it's interesting to see it cropping up because of Jesus' teaching about people and the needs for life, not just payment for work. So there is a proposition from Galston in those two parables about a different way to live. The teachings of Jesus are a very large and important part of the Gospels, and they can help us shape our lifestyle. As Christian leaders gave more time to discussing and arguing about how to explain who Jesus was, they gave less and less attention to what Jesus taught. I noticed Lorraine Parkinson in our audience today, and she has written a very helpful book called Made on Earth, in which the ministry of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus are substantially changed and transferred into a system of beliefs about Jesus. By the time of the Nicene Creed, early in the 4th century, it was all about who Jesus was and what to believe. There was silence about what Jesus taught. I don't know about you, but I find the beliefs part of that creed unbelievable, but some of the wisdom of Jesus, especially some parables, I find inspirational and quite uncomfortably challenging. One of the most challenging sentences in the whole of David Galston's book, I will use as a challenging conclusion to this program. He writes, "The growth of theology is the silencing of Jesus. The more people argued about who Jesus was, the less they listened to what Jesus taught. Jesus said, 'Let those who have ears listen. Let them listen, let them hear.' I hope you find that of some interest." Thanks, Lorna.
Over to Dick in a moment to close our meeting, but I just also want to express my enormous thanks to the participants who have who've put this together. David Merritt. I want to thank Rex again today, and we'll make sure that he gets our thanks, and Greg for stepping in today as one of our speakers. And I think back to the other sessions that we've had, and I think most of us have been part of. Lorraine Parkinson and Val Webb and David Gunson, thank you to these people who've put in such care and thought into their presentations to us. We've learned so much. And to Greg Crow for tremendous technical support, without which most of this wouldn't have worked properly, with not only Zoom, but in-person meetings as well. So thank you very much. And to everyone who's been part of conversation, questions, and putting your thoughts in. It's much appreciated by PCNV. So thank you. And I'm going to hand over to Dick to close our proceedings, but we might want to say thank you to all those people mentioned.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Lorna. And I too would like to pay particular acknowledgement to David for this series. It was his concept. He was helped by a couple of other committee members, PCNV committee members, and he's been the driving force through it. So thank you, David. It's been a successful series, and you have put personally a huge amount of work into it, and that is shown by the way that the material that's come through has been received. And Lorna, to you too, you've been a gracious moderator throughout, and that requires quite a bit of work on your part too, which we know, and we thank you very much for being prepared to make that effort. It's very great value to everybody, I think. So thanks very much, and those present might like to show their appreciation by pressing the hand on the reaction, or otherwise signaling it. So thanks very much. There will be a recording, as Greg has already said, a recording of this session. We have to, and it's sort of the royal, not the royal we there, it's Greg Crow basically has got to find the time to review the recording and format it properly before it gets up on the website. And there's a huge amount of work goes into doing that. But it will be, the session will be up on the website in the next couple of weeks or so. Next month there is no meeting. We're going to have a midwinter recess. So you can program to do something else on the fourth Sunday, afternoon of the fourth Sunday of next month. The month after, they'll be back on again, and this will be a session dealing with the Voice to Parliament debate, and the Reverend Canon Glenn Lockery will be the lead participant in that event. It may very well be that we try to make this event a physical meeting only, because we do believe that there's a great deal of value in people being able to come together in a real face-to-face situation rather than to do so electronically, which is very, very helpful, very convenient, but it's not still the same thing as being in the same room with other people and being interactive with other friends on a very personal and face-to-face basis.
Dick, can I just say on that matter, there would be no trouble with us recording that session so that we could still have a recorded audio visual on the website. So for those who wouldn't be able to make a face-to-face, we could still record it and then put a copy of it up later on the website.
Yeah, that's thank you for that, Greg. That's, I think, good for people to know. Well, with that, thank you very much for your attendance. We've had a very good number participate this afternoon, which I think is encouraging for us all, that this sort of format and presentation is appreciated by people who have an interest in progressive Christianity. And so we thank you for your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 months' time. Cheerio.